and to do our curriculum. So in lockdown, what that's looked like is a lot of remote support. We have been calling all our students every week. We've been doing a lot of help with homework over the phone, and we're just imminently reopening our centres. So we've got our staff back, and we hope to get our students back in the next couple of weeks. So that's a bit of a snapshot from me. Adrian, do you want to give us a little bit of insight into your experiences?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Adrian Hawkins. I teach in the history department at the University of Bristol. So I've been there now for 3 years, and my research is environmental history. So a lot of the classes I teach relate to the environment, particularly polar regions is my research specialty. Before that, I was teaching I got my PhD from the University of Texas, and I taught in Colorado for 10 years. So I've got a little bit of experience of higher education in the United States as well. So perhaps to draw on some of that.
Great. Isla, do you want to jump in next?
Hi.
Yeah.
I'm Iola. I am a student. I go to Cotton School and in Bristol. And for me, education in lockdown, it has been entirely at home. So I haven't been to school since March. So it's been work set by teachers for 2 terms and a bit, but not seeing teachers at all.
Thank you very much. And Richard, finally.
Hi, I'm Richard. I'm the head of sixth form, assistant head at St Mary Redcliffe School. So our sixth form is now about 700 students. I go to St Stephen's Church. I was one of the founder members of Foundation many moons ago and its predecessor groups. And I taught Bianca once upon a time. For me, lockdown has been furiously busy from day one. So with a very large number of post-16 students obviously being taught from home, large numbers of them we knew were exceptionally fragile, really struggling. And we were trying to sort of get them stuff to keep their learning going, keep their progression going, keep their mental health at adequate levels at least. A lot of our focus was on communication. We did weekly assemblies virtually. We did lots of other messaging to parents and students just to try and keep them connected and buoyed along to some extent. Obviously, I was also coordinating our team, doing lots of personal calls and other things to try and pick up those who were most fragile. So that was that bit of it. At the same time, I was responsible for firstly the calculated grade process at GCSE and A-level in our school, then planning and scheduling the return to school for the students who came in for those last few weeks, then the GCSE and A-level grading fiasco and managing that one and the communication around that, and then the recruitment fallout of that when both university and A-level grades and GCSE grades got hiked. So we had all of the university fall out of that, and we also had the fact that suddenly lots more people got their GCSE grades than we're expecting, and so our A-level numbers also spiked, and we've had to sort of manage all of that too. So it's been a funny old time.
Thank you so much, Richard. So hopefully you can see we've got quite a different array of experience and insight into the educational system. And there'll be a little bit of time later for questions if you want to ask particular people. But let's start off by thinking, if you could change one thing about the education system, what would it be and what would that look like? Isla, do you want to kick us off with your idea? No pressure.
Sure. Sure. I thought about this for a bit. I don't know, but the main sort of vague thought that I had was that I would like it if education was had more sort of discussion and input from more people. So it was less like you were just being taught sort of like you were being given information and more like you were able to discuss that more, because I think a lot of times when people don't like certain lessons or don't like going to school, I think it's because it can feel quite sort of, I don't know, like you're just being told information and expected to like process it and sort of compute it rather than actually like discussing it and learning as a group. So I think I would like it if it was more of like a group thing, learning as a whole in schools.
That's great. So more about the style. Does that also connect to what you're learning as well? Would you change the kind of what's actually taught in that as well, or is it more about that style?
I think partly. I think there would be, content that you could teach that would work better taught like that than how it's currently taught, and that would mean you could teach other things. But also I think just in general as a way to approach teaching and learning.
Great, thank you very much. Adrian, jumping into the higher education sector, what's your big idea?
So this is a really hard question, just come up with one. So I think we'll be talking about diversity later on and exams later on. So I'm going to use that as an excuse to say those are really important things, and it would be good to change those. But I think my thing actually sort of follows on from Iola's, that I think maybe trying to make education a little bit more of a conversation. So I think traditionally we've had this model of the expert standing on the stage, giving a lecture, the students writing down what they hear. And I think that's a very conservative model of education and creates, I think, a lack of opportunity to really learn. And so if we can really think about how to make education more conversational, that the teacher in any given situation is learning from the students as the students learn from the teacher, I think that's going to be a really key thing. To do that, I think more experiential learning, creating situations where you're maybe outside of the classroom. When I was in Colorado, we had a really good project where we took students up to the national park, Rocky Mountain National Park, for a week and worked with park rangers and students and historians to ask, how can history inform the management of the park? And nobody had the answers. So it really was a case of trying to collectively work towards something that was new. And I think because of that, everyone gained something. So anything we can do to make education more conversational, less hierarchical, less the expert speaking to everyone else, I think is going to be beneficial for education.
Thank you, Adrian. And Richard?
I would agree with both of those things. And in fairness, particularly, I mean, my experience is predominantly in post-16 education at the moment, and in my own teaching and that of most of my colleagues, I think that is exactly what they would aspire to in the majority of their post-16 lessons. So I think it might be helpful to reflect more on what stops that happening more than it already does. And it's sort of trite to say, if I had a time machine, I would just go back and persuade somebody to offer Michael Gove a very, very well-paid job just before he became Education Secretary. But I would, because that broke a lot of stuff. But I think post-16, one of the things that stops that happen is just the massively overstuffed nature of A-level syllabuses. That was certainly driven by Gove. And the sense of pressure, therefore, that teachers feel under just to power through content really, really fast, because otherwise you don't get to the end of it. There is no optionality in A-level exams. You have to cover absolutely everything to the same standard. Everything is completely high stakes on the exams. There is nothing else that counts towards students' final grade apart from those exams. So everything's loaded on that. Students' expectations of the grades that they need to get to the universities they want to get are so high, and that's what you feel you need to deliver for them. I think the universities themselves possibly need to reflect on their impact on this, because another thing I would do is to diversify the post-16 curriculum more than it is. We're the only country for thousands of miles around that thinks that students from 16 to 18 should only be studying 3 subjects, and that everything else can go hang. And when we used to have visitors come to us from Belgium, actually came across and to visit our sixth form, and they would come and my students would say, so how many students do you study? And they would say 10. How many do you study? And they'd say 3. And they would think this was like they'd walked into a madhouse, and of course they have. But it's the universities that drive that, because they want A-level students to be taught to the same standard that they always have been, so that they don't have to do that work. And so they drive that narrowing curriculum, and the government fuels it. And the other thing that absolutely fuels it is Ofsted and league tables, because everything then becomes so exceptionally high stakes in terms of all those things that would add to the richness of the student experience and deepen learning, and all of those things get absolutely squished by the sense that if we don't somehow achieve this number and that letter, then nobody will come, and then our finances will tank. So the Ofsted and league tables thing is locked very tightly to student funding as drivers of this narrowing experience, because everybody feels in such a fragile situation. The wheels could fall off of a school so quickly and so fast, leading to such a rapid spiraling down of financial viability and staffing and everything else. You've just got to keep that letter high and that number high. And if you manage that, you keep the show on the road for a little bit longer. And that's clearly not remotely the most important thing in students' well-being, learning, and progression in life. But it pulls you so hard in the wrong direction, unfortunately.
Thank you, Richard. I think my big idea, and this is not so much of a logistical suggestion, there are some logistics you might want to work out on this, but would be to have a lottery system for admissions. That could be for higher education, that could be for secondary education. But it'd be really interesting to see schools where the makeup, for example, of free school meals was the same in every school across the city. It would be interesting to see what difference that would make to resources in a school if you didn't have big clusters of students with free school meals, for example, in the east and south of Bristol. So that's kind of my thinking. Might throw out some ideas for people when we come to questions later on. That has in fact been trialled in Brighton previously. I did a little bit of research on it, and there seemed to be some tentative suggestions that in Brighton it was having some impact on the makeup of schools and how education was, how fair education was in the city. But it was quite shortly phased out, and I think, I could be wrong, but I think that there's actually a government mandate that lotteries are not allowed in school admissions at the moment. So to move on, I think there were some ideas that came up there in the things that the panel was saying, and perhaps we could get stuck into this one, which is, should we just abolish exams? Do we just want to scrap them altogether? Richard, maybe you want to start.
I think it's interesting actually, because obviously I've been doing head of sixth form for 20 odd years or more. So in the year 2000, for those who were alive then or can remember back that far, the government introduced AS levels and therefore a modular approach to A levels. So for that period of time, most sixth form students did do 4 subjects for a while until Michael Gove took that away. And you could work at exams and try them, do not so well, have another go, and so on, do coursework. That sort of breaking down of it, much more closely to mirror the experience of that students have in universities, was the norm. In that scenario, everybody then sort of started to complain that students were over-examined, and therefore the response from government was, well, let's crunch it all back to the end again. Obviously, there is no less examination going on. It just all happens in one 3-week period rather than at different times. It's exactly the same number of hours of exams now as there was then. But I guess what people were objecting to was that sense of there's always an exam coming. And going back to what Iola said, and there is never then that sense of we can just sort of bed into this subject for a while and let it breathe and not be thinking about exams. And I do think there's a lot to be said for that. I do think we therefore, we over-examine for sure. Post-16, you probably do need to have something at the end of the 2 years that does act as a gateway through to higher education, but it doesn't have to be as heavy as it is, and it almost certainly should have a greater mix of assessment styles in it than it does. I think pre-16, we could examine a lot less, and obviously most countries and cultures do. They place more weight on teacher assessments or on continuous assessments or for a range of things, and much less weight on what we currently have, which is a vast, particularly now with coursework gone, a vast number of exams done by 16-year-olds in a 2 or 3 week period. It's absolutely inhuman, I think, what they're put through. I think you probably do have to assess maths and English, but I suspect very strongly that the rest could probably dilute. But it does slightly come back to the thing about league tables again. The whole government's model of assessing schools is premised on there being these exams. And I think, to be honest, they're more to assess schools than they are to assess students. If the government was slightly less fixated on assessing schools, they could live with far, far fewer exams, because the students genuinely don't need them in order for us to calibrate access to the right courses post-16.
And as a teacher, do you see any learning benefits of exams, either for teacher assessment or for are they good for some students?
They probably are, but we would prefer, it's not that we wouldn't assess, we would do the full range of things that teachers do. We would do things in class, we would do verbal things, we would do tests, we would do controlled work. Of course you would, because you want to develop those skills, you want students to internalize content so that they can then apply it. You are limited in your capacity to engage with the higher levels of a subject if you haven't internalized content that you can then apply, particularly in some subjects, certainly in maths and sciences and those where that's very strongly the case. So you would want to do some of that, but you would do it on the basis of its value to further learning, rather than because we've got to get them to the point where they can sit, what is essentially 20 odd exams in a 14-day period.
Thank you. Iola, would you scrap exams or keep them?
I think there is too much pressure on exams. I think there are some sort of ways of doing things definitely at GCSE level. So I haven't started GCSEs yet, but as of September, that's when I start. And one subject I'm doing is drama, and my school do a drama BTEC instead of a drama GCSE. And there is an exam, but there is no written exam. So 60% of the grade is throughout the year, and then the other bit is one performance at the end. And I think that makes more sense. And I think it particularly makes more sense in subjects like drama and like art and like not like maths and science, because it makes more sense for that to be examining more practical skills than like, and of course the theory is important, but the theory is important because of how it affects when you do stuff practically. So I think, particularly in those more creative subjects, it should be possible to teach them without exams, but definitely without so many exams and so much of the work depending on the exams. That's kind of my take on it.
Thank you. I famously managed to cultivate a higher education 3 years with one exam by choosing all courses that were coursework assessed. Adrian, would you scrap exams in higher education? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So every term we have a meeting of lecturers and we look at each other's exam questions and go carefully through them and sort of dot the T's and make sure that they're expansive questions that can sort of test the full range of the student understanding of the material. And we often look around and think we would never do this ourselves. So as historians, we write articles, we research, we write books. And if you said, right, you have 2 hours, closed book, read all you can, then sit down and write an academic article and send it into a prestigious journal. So we're asking students to do something that we don't do, which is quite interesting. There's a couple of colleges in the United States that have just scrapped assessment completely. And I think that they're private universities, and there's an element of prestige that just going there, that the idea is that students can just explore subjects and do as much or as little as they like, and then it's more about what they get out of it at the end. But sort of underlying that is the sort of, well, you were at that college anyway, you must have been at a high enough level to get in. So I think we need to be a little bit careful in terms of sort of equity and accessibility to education, to say that assessment is one way of allowing access to education, and it does often, or it can, if it's used correctly, undermine established hierarchy. So sometimes the idea of getting rid of exams, getting rid of assessment, can actually be quite conservative potentially. But I would agree with Richard and Iola and say that rebalancing, that there's my favorite things to read at university are the third year dissertations, when students can go away and write a 10,000 word essay on a subject of their choice. And those tend to be really creative, really interesting, novel, interesting, and they're actually fun to read. Whereas reading through 20 exam papers on a topic that we've set tend to be less inspiring. So I think a rebalancing, but not necessarily getting rid of assessment completely.
Thank you,
Adrian. I can just echo that, because for those who don't know, one of the innovations going back 10 years or more in the post-16 curriculum is the extended project qualification, which is a 5,000 word dissertation on anything the student wishes to do. It's an absolutely fabulous thing. It's by far the thing that develops their skills for progression the most out of anything that they will do. But the number of students who drop it in the second year, when they realize that the universities are not going to include it in their offer. They're only going to offer on the basis of their 3 examined A levels. And therefore, it's going to be the exams done in those last 3 weeks that matter, and nothing else will matter. So it's the thing that should matter most that goes, because the perceived pressure of that final set of terminal exams is so intense. And that's the university's fault, actually, because they could so easily have done differently. But COVID is the other thing that has shown the error of our ways, because with this totally terminally loaded exam system, we ended up with what happened this summer, which was a group of students who could not take exams, and nothing else existed. Nothing had been done under any sort of conditions that could be fairly and comparably assessed. So we sowed the seeds of that particular catastrophe as soon as we did that. You could easily have varied, exactly as Iona said, you could have varied the kind of things that were assessed. You could have empowered teachers to make judgments more, and you would have ended up with a much more robust system for difficulty, as well as a much more healthy one in terms of learning.
So I think this kind of come up a little bit before, perhaps, I know in what Richard was saying earlier, but thinking for a minute about what students are learning around curriculum, there have been big curriculum reforms in Scotland. There's a huge curriculum reform underway in Wales, which is due to be launched into schools in 2022. Both of those curriculums move away from the more prescribed elements of the national curriculum. In Wales, moving away from fixed progression points to an idea of suggested progression points by certain points. There's also been movements much more recently around decolonising the curriculum, around the Black Lives Matter movement and other things like that. Is it time to change what people are learning in schools, in universities, and if so, what should we be having instead? Adrian?
So another small question. I mean, I think the curriculum obviously does need to continually innovate, and I think the danger is if it stagnates and we just do the same thing over and over again. We've had an experience in the history department at Bristol over the last 2 or 3 years, moving from a British Empire class for first year students coming in to making that a modern world class, which has a lot of the attempts to decolonize the curriculum, to move away from a sort of it's not necessarily glorifying the British Empire the way it was taught, but embedded in focusing on British imperialism. That sort of gives a focus to the class that we've moved away from with the modern world. Getting a diversity of voices in the readings is really important, that students are seeing multiple perspectives coming from lots of different people. That often is not necessarily reflected. I think there's lots of structural issues in universities that prevent a genuine diversity or reflection of society among the lecturers who are actually giving the lectures. But it's going to be really important that we take steps to include these much wider range of viewpoints and approaches to history, so that people can feel this is there, they can connect to the way they're reading and understanding the curriculum that they're doing. So I think that we do need to be continually asking these questions about the curriculum, and also reflecting on what we're doing politically with the materials we're teaching, and how we can, at the moment, decolonizing is really important, and I think is something to be doing at, I know the university level, but I think we need to be doing that at every level. I think one other thing to say is that sometimes, and it's a lot to do with the pressures that Richard was talking about, but if we could have students taking a range of history subjects that are beyond Cold War, Second World War, the Tudors, when they come to Bristol, there may be a willingness and a sort of an excitement to take courses in different subjects outside what they know. But the pressure to do well, to get good marks in the exams, does also lead to a conservatism in course choices, that you tend to take courses that you've done a little bit before, so you know. So the sooner in the education system that we implement these changes, I think it's going to run all the way through and have a positive impact on everyone.
I'd like to think I was that tactical, but it led to me choosing a course on medieval Scottish history at university, which did not go well. Thank you. Richard, do you want to jump in next?
At secondary, obviously, all the rules were rewrit 2 or 3 years ago, so the prospects of anything loosening for us in the lifetime of this government are vanishingly small, I think, which is desperately sad, because at Key Stage 3, 4 and 5, everything was locked down so tightly and so retrogressively 3 years ago that we're going to be living with that for a number of years still. The narrowing of A-levels, the stuffing of content, and the prescriptiveness that was written into what the exam boards could do, and it was written by Ofqual at government direction. So there is no choice left post-16 on the topics. Very little on the topics you get to do, and even on the content of those topics. I teach philosophy, and I used to teach RE for many, many years, and taught an absolutely wonderful unit. I really loved it at A-level, but it died with the curriculum reform 3 years ago. I taught the whole history of God. Bianca, did you do my history of God unit? I can't remember. Were you before then?
I don't think I did history of God. No.
You might have been before that. But the history of God unit, it really was just the history of God. Multiple religions, 2,500 years of stretch. That died, and it became exceptionally prescriptive what had to go in. You post 16, you had to do these festivals, you had to do those doctrines, you had to why? And it became a soulless thing, a really tough thing to teach. And that's across the piece in post 16 subjects. That curriculum reform then drove the GCSE one, which was ramped up, stuffed full of content, and made very prescriptive to deliver for A-level what the universities had said they wanted A-level to deliver. And then the Key Stage 3 one was rewritten again very prescriptively to lead to this, to lead to this, to lead to that. So the whole thing has been, locked down so tightly now, and a bomb needs to go off under it, to be honest.
And if that could happen, if we were being more hopeful for a moment, what would you have?
What would you do?
What would you teach?
You would allow a lot more. What you've talked about in Wales and Scotland is exactly right, and what so many other countries are doing. We've got a partner school in Uganda who I've visited twice, and who are doing the Ugandan government, bless them, did launched brilliant curriculum reform 2 or 3 years ago, and I suspect it got slightly stymied by other things, but it was exceptionally interconnected and skills-based and progressive and developmental. That is great.
Do you have any hope? Do you have any hope that curriculum reform happening in the rest of the UK, if not right now, will have any impact?
I think it will. I think it will only when there's a change of government, because I don't think, partly for other reasons, too much, scary and bigger fish to fry in terms of the economy and health for some time. I don't think education is going to get a look in for 3 or 4 years, which is not very hopeful, I'm afraid. But I think that this group of people will move on. Eventually, Nick Gibb has been in the Department of Education now for 10 years. What he says goes. And when Nick Gibb moves on and he's no longer being micromanaged by Mike Gove, things could shift. But I suspect it'll take a change of government to shift it. And yeah, then it will, because it's so obviously wrong. And educationalists up and down the country are screaming for it. Broader curriculum post 16, much less regulated, much more scope for creativity from teachers, much more focus on skills development, much more cultural diversity. All of these things are obviously the right thing to do.
Ayala, your thoughts?
I think it sort of feels as though there are attempts being made to make by teachers within schools to make, with like the decolonization of things. So there's more sort of discussion about where information comes from and how trustworthy it is and why we look at certain sources. It's more sort of, I don't know what the word is, but I think that it still feels like it's within the subjects that they, not that they have to teach, but that they, again, like you're saying, that they teach so that people will do better when they then go on to doing it to doing whatever the subject is for GCSE and for A-level. So they're still teaching, the Cold War and the World Wars and the Tudors, because they want to give people a good footing for that to be able to do well in the exams. But it feels like they're trying to look at it more, like looking at different sides of it and stuff, which I guess makes sense, because as teachers, that's like what they want to do, but it is still within this. They want to have people to do their courses so that they can, and to do well at their courses for like the standardization and for funding and things like that. So it's still very limited, I guess. That's there.
Thank you. So I think one of the key things that has been underlined these last few months is around equality in education, or lack of equality. The Education Policy Institute this week talked about the gaps growing in attainment between the most affluent students and the least affluent students, and one group now between 2011 and 2018, the gap between Black Caribbean pupils had grown from 6.5 months at GCSEs to 10.9 months, and that was pre-COVID. Similarly, my experience of working with families during lockdown is regularly knowing families where there's 4 or 5 siblings sharing a device. That device might be a phone to do homework on. These things seem to be a real problem, and these are happening within our city, big inequalities between students, between how they can access education. How can we make our system fairer, but how can we also make it so that it is more equitable, not just more equal for students? Richard, where would you start?
I think you're right about the digital divide, and clearly over the course of the lockdown and probably over the course of the next year, whilst inevitably there's going to be a mixture of school learning and home learning, it's obviously going to happen. That's going to exacerbate things hugely, and so serious funding going to resource families with digital equipment and then digital literacy, and that's about working closely with families, working with parents and carers, educating them, training them in the use of this, helping them do that. The schools in Bristol, and you work with some of them who are doing very best work in this, are developing exceptionally strong relationships with parents and carers, and bringing them into school and helping them understand the processes and the techniques and the devices so that they're empowered back at home. That would be a very significant move, and it's going to require a big amount of money thrown at it. There are programs across the nation and in Bristol that are doing a bit of that. The Future Quest program is a very positive one, into university that you work with, a very positive one. But they touch such a small proportion, and their funding is still so limited. It's a fraction of those who would really benefit from it.
Iola, what do you think?
I can't think of sort of anything more interesting or groundbreaking than just funding the systems that are already in place to help students, and also more of them. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a very simple answer in a way, but actually, and I think that's a lot of the things that are coming out of the news this week is saying we really need a society approach at funding young people, and the young people who need to be targeted. There also needs to be, it's not just a question of schools and what they're doing or what charities and other organisations are doing, but as a society we need a much more extensive approach to funding things around children and young people. Absolutely. Adrian, what would your take be from the university angle?
But I think it may be a little controversial to say. I think the Office for Students and the creating financial incentives for universities to develop access and participation plans that lead to contextual offers being given and work being done to try and bring increased opportunities, have summer schools and opportunities during the school year for students who wouldn't necessarily be thinking about university to come in and really think about, could I come to somewhere like Bristol and study, and say, yes, you can. So I think there is something getting done correctly in the current system, but it's based on massively it's charging fees that are way too much, so that it's sort of masking wider structural inequalities in that. So I do think we need to really think about student fees and ask what they're actually doing to higher education. You come in and you're looking at £50,000-60,000 at least of debt coming out of a 3-year course, which is problematic, particularly if you're not from a rich background, and that money seems immense at the time. So probably really thinking about the funding structures for universities, which gets you into much bigger questions about should university be from 18 to 21, as a sort of the majority of people go to university, this sort of rite of passage. Would university be better as a sort of continuing all the way through somebody's life and career when you're taking classes because you need them, or you want to be doing that at that time and it's going to benefit you. So potentially throwing it all open and rethinking the models would be good for for access. I guess bringing it back down to a level where it's a little bit more realistic. I think one important thing that we can do at universities, so to become a university lecturer, you need to do a PhD, or almost everyone has got a PhD. Funding for PhD study is really, really hard to get. And so you often get people funding their own way through PhDs. And I was thinking about this today, that almost no other career, I would think, has a model where you pay for your own apprenticeship. You're paying a huge amount of money to just get the qualification you need to be part of that. And the result of that is that you see a very white, privileged, in America they call it the professoriate, but the sort of the people who become lecturers tend to come from wealthy backgrounds and to be able to take the risks that allow them to do a PhD, which means you're not seeing a diversity in the people who are lecturing, which I think then filters down, and people coming to our Access to Bristol days aren't getting classes from people who they can relate to or who look like them. And so the problem is really all the way through. But I would like to see a lot more funding for postgraduate study to really increase the pool of people who can be lecturers. And that would also see a value of education out from society. So we need to, I think, change the model that getting a PhD in history and becoming a police officer, for example, that should be seen as a good thing and a positive for society, that we have a sort of historical consciousness and research in that field. But it's such a narrow way of thinking that we have at the moment that we don't allow for that, and it sort of squeezes opportunities all the way through.
Thank you. We'll now have an opportunity for questions more generally, or comments, anything people would like to add. There's not loads of us, so hopefully just unmute yourself and indicate. If we have a rush, then we can go to hands up or something. But if anyone has any questions they would like to ask the panel, Peter, is it?
Yeah, it's not really a question. Just say, like, I've worked as an English teacher in 4 countries over 5 years, and I did a course with Bristol Uni about changing the education system at the end of last year. And I've looked at different models around the world, and there are different models that are working and up and running. I've put some in the chat box for people to see. And there's also a teacher from America, he won an award for his teaching. He was a teacher for 27 years, saying how the education system actually dumbs people down. And he's saying, should we carry on doing it? And basically, I just come from the point of view that every child is a genius in some way or other, and it's school's job and education means to draw out of someone, whereas our education system, as the young lady said, is more like ramming information into them instead of drawing out of them what their talents and gifts are. And the school should be looking at what is this child's gift, what is their talent, what have they got to bring to the world, and then we should be developing around the child. So it should be student-centered. Again, I've put links in the chat box about methods that already do this. There's an Italian one that does this. And it's about keeping the love of the subject alive. The emotional content of the child is not taken into account. Like, do they love this subject or not? Or does that even matter if they love it or not? Because your whole brain chemistry changes when you love a subject or if you hate a subject, if you're forced to do something or if you do something through choice. This is very essential, I feel. And then it's just about, and then in Finland, you're talking about exams. I think Finland doesn't have exams or very few exams, and they have better results than they lead the way in that regard. And yeah, it's like building personal qualities over just subject-based things as well, because confidence and self-expression are also key to get to get on in this world. If you don't have that, but you have a load of intellectual knowledge, it's not really going to serve you very well in your life. So we need practical skills instead of book knowledge. You know, you can't learn things from a book. You have to do it. You can't learn how to ride a bike through a book. You have to ride a bike. You get what I mean? So that's what I'd like to say. Thank you. Yeah.
Carla?
Yeah, I'm kind of on Peter's wavelength. Yeah, it's an interesting discussion. I just have to say I'm a little disappointed in how non-radical it is, because it seems to be just about how do we tweak a system that's, rather than looking at that rejigging of the whole thing and talking about history, the history of the British and English education system has just established what it is, and in some ways that makes me think you almost have to just start again, because anything else is tweaking around with something that is fundamentally not designed to benefit children, not designed around what we now know about how children and young people learn, not designed around what we know about their emotional and mental well-being. It's designed around creating a way of controlling the masses to make them into a workforce for an industrial system that no longer exists. And now we're trying to tweak it to make it create a workforce for the system that we now have by flushing off the top lot that are going to become the managers and IT whatnots, and leaving everybody else to work in low wage economy. So, you know, it's still not looking fundamentally at how do we actually give our children a childhood and an education for them rather than for the rest of society. And so the question of, you know, a better world, there has to be a better education. There has to be a completely different focus of education for a different world. That's what I would say. And so many people are working on it, and so many people are doing it. You know, I've done it. Home educate. You don't like the way the system works, just get out of it, because I would not put my daughter went through school. She went through the 2 A-levels, fortunately before Gove got his hands on it all, because I would not put a child of mine into that system now. And she just about, you know, it was only just doable when she was doing it. Because it's become very, very toxic for the majority of children. As somebody was saying to me today, how important his son's not been at school and how important it is for him to have the social activity. And yeah, that works great for some children, but for other children, school is not a beneficial social environment. It's a toxic environment. And what's being done about that?
What would your radical kind of new approach look like for you? What would your thinking be about how that would be?
I would say no, that school should no longer be compulsory. In fact, it isn't compulsory, because education is what's necessary. That's why we don't have to send our children to school. We can educate them at home. But let schools actually be places that facilitate the education of children and with their parents. Not that you have to be there 9 to 5, do all the subjects that you're told to do, pass all the exams you have to pass, but that you have there the resources and the facilities and the knowledge and the ability to learn what you want to learn, what you're interested in learning at the place that is suiting you personally. You know, we have this incredible obsession with getting children to learn to write and read before they can even manage to potty train themselves. What are we doing to them? It's crazy. And if a child doesn't learn to read till they're 10, there's no difference in their reading age between a child that learns to read at 10 and a child that's learned to read at 5. By the time they're 15, they're reading the same. And probably the child that's learned to read at 10 will read more because they enjoy it. So what are we doing? Why are we doing that? You know, and we have to go to school. If a child misses the day of school, we have to find the parents, because we're going to totally destroy their education. And all these children have not been in school for 3 months. Their education has only been destroyed by a corrupt and ridiculous exam system. You know, like what on earth is going on? That's what I say. End this ridiculous kind of compulsory nature of education, and make it a place and a gift, because every child wants to learn. Every child wants to look into their future and say, this is what I want for my future, and what do I have to do for it? I was so hard on my kids. You know, from the age of 12, what do you want to do with your future? Where are you going to go? Because our whole curriculum was focused around their desire for their future. The one who wanted to be a lorry driver, he's a bus driver now. The one who wanted to join the Royal Navy and be a merchant navy, he's in the Royal Fleet Auxiliary. He went to school to do the exams he had to do to get into that, to do what he wanted to do. The one who couldn't get off the computer, he's a computer programmer.
So maybe something in finding that passion that people have and encouraging that in education. And so maybe actually that feeds into some of the education reforms that are happening in other parts of the country. It'd be interesting to see how they go. And I think something Adrian alluded to around potential different approaches to university. And I know there's a university professor, Tom Spellinger, I think, at Bristol, who's written a book which imagines a different future for what universities might look like, which is definitely worth looking up, and follows that approach of having perhaps lifelong learning and different stages of university, which is an interesting approach as well. I think we had a question from Sarah.
Yes, I qualified as a teacher in 1974, and when we were studying the philosophy of education, there's a school, it still exists in Suffolk, called Summerhill, which is a very democratic style of learning. It's a private school, and we had a philosophy of education lecturer who said to us, schools have a failing that they tend to equate uniformity with equality. So they think they're offering an equal education. What they're offering is a uniform education, where you start the children off a bit like a horse race, that you assume everybody's the same, and if they're not, then you, like horses, you put a few extra weights in the saddlebag. And actually what we should have is an equal education, which has been talked about today. What I find to be incredibly disappointing is in that intervening period since 1974, I've got married, I've had 3 children who have had to go through the system. At some point in their educations, I home educated all of them because of a dissatisfaction with a system which was getting worse, not better, since I actually trained. And we look at the situation now, and I could weep with how it's become, and with even less equality, especially for minority groups, for the social differences between the rich and poor. You've talked about it this afternoon, but it just seems that, how can that have happened? Really, that's my question. How can that have happened that in 1974 we thought we were moving to this new way of democratic, equal education, and here we are with the summer that we've just had, and with the fiasco of the exam results? So it's really a question rather than point that I raise.
I think I would add in, my knowledge of my colleagues is much more optimistic than what I say about the system, because I completely agree with all that's just been said about the toxic nature of the constraints within which schools currently have to function. But nonetheless, almost to a person, the colleagues that I work with day by day believe passionately exactly the kinds of things that the 3 of you have just said, and are doing their level best to try and value every individual as an individual, to find what makes them fire, to find their particular strengths and skills and ambitions, to promote that where humanly possible, to bring joy and love of a subject into their learning. That is what my colleagues believe and what gets them out of bed in the morning. The problem is the constraints that they have to work within that drive the number of subjects that have to be done, the attendance regime, the exams regime, and all of this. And you just can't break that easily from they push the boundaries as far as they can, but you can't break those things easily from within the system. It's very hard to do.
Bianca, did you have your hand up for a question?
Yes. So I'll take my hand down in a minute. But yes, it is a question, really. I'm afraid I don't have much to contribute. I don't work in education, but I do have an interest in it. I was wondering and I imagined that Richard and Adrian would have thoughts on this. What your thoughts are on the kind of quite populist argument that kids should learn more kind of life skills and learn more about kind of fundamentally how the world works in school. So the idea that they should be learning cookery properly, they should be learning money management, how to budget properly, they should be learning how taxes work, that those kinds of sort of more hands-on life skills based things rather than things that are more academic. I mean, my thoughts are, I don't know the answer to that. I'm a bit kind of confused on that. I was having a conversation with a friend the other day who kind of said, we were sort of talking about sort of the so-say obesity crisis and the government's response to that, and he was arguing, kids need to learn cookery and they need to learn how to budget in schools. And my kind of left response to that is like, no, people don't educate themselves out of poverty, and there are far more complex reasons for that. And I think also, that kind of removal of some of those life skills, is a good result of kind of the patriarchy going away. Girls used to learn needlework and and home economics and stuff like that, and that's gone. But I guess in terms of the sort of learning about things like how the system they operate in works, so how economics works, do you think that that could be a really positive thing? Because actually a lot of people are really kept in the dark about how the kind of establishment run society works, and how they are for the most part exploited by that. Or do you think in a way that could be a bad thing, because it could actually just kind of create a generation of more kind of hardened neoliberals, certainly if like Gove or his cronies have any kind of control over creating that syllabus? So it's a bit of a ramble, but what are your thoughts on that kind of argument? And if kids were to kind of learn that kind of stuff, would it have a positive effect in terms of having kind of more kind of engaged free thinking systems?
Did you have some thoughts on that first?
I have some fairly rambly thoughts also, but I don't know, but the idea that the students should learn about how to cook healthy food and how taxes work is something that I would say the majority of people my age in my year group think and agree with. And so when I talk to my friends my age, they're like, often like if they've just come out of a really boring maths lesson, they're like, why are we learning this? Why are we learning this and not how the world works? That feels more important to us. So that's my contribution as someone who, talks.
Thank you. Richard or Adrian, did you have any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I think we do need to really ask the question about relevance and how it fits in. And if whatever you're studying, if you can't see how this relates to your life experiences and where you are, it's gonna be, it's not valuable directly, and it may be of sort of, vague interest of sort of just for academic interest. But I think we need to be careful at just teaching a sort of functionality that I think what I see my goal at Bristol as trying to teach or encourage people to really think and ask questions and learning how to ask these questions. And I think history is a really useful subject for doing that, because you're engaging with cultures and people and ideas that are very different from your own. And you have to ask, where do these ideas and cultures come from? And how do I then apply that? Why, as a white privileged male in Bristol, where did this come from? And how can, what are the structures that have created the society that we live in? And I think needing to understand these structures is important for starting to ask questions about how do we change it? Why are we so keen to hold on to the privileges that we have? These are questions that help us to think about education system, but also society more generally. So I really do think that we need to be asking the day-to-day questions about taxes, about cooking and food, and where the food is coming from, and then how that connects to climate change and the industrial agricultural system. But so it's got to be relevant, but it's also got to be creative and critical, and we've got to be thinking deeply about these issues. And it's a combination. When those things come together, I think you get the really important education.
Just link it back to the point that Carla made earlier about reading, because I think I'm just talking about the practicalities of some of this from my experience, and then I've taught lessons about the sort of things I was talking about. In our sixth form, we have a supplementary course that most students do in global citizenship, which is just doing this kind of thing, trying to open their eyes and minds to the way that the world works and the way that people view it differently. And we do that, and some people still walk out of it, and maybe that's just because we just have to keep getting better at making those lessons really active. But I know people still walk out of that and say, why do they make me do that? You know, I could have been whatever. Because there is a sense in which these are the kind of questions that only really sing for people and move when they're asking that question. If they're asking that question, then they really engage and they learn. And if they're not asking that question, telling them how their tax is calculated and how the economy works and so on, how the voting system works, is not necessarily going to get them any more excited. So I think we just have to think how we do this. But we definitely should do it, but we have to think how we do it. Because these things always work best when people are, you need to stimulate the curiosity so that they ask the question, so that the answers that you then open up as possibles resonate with people in some way. And the other thing, I guess, to think about is the fact that as soon as you go into all of these territories, you're into very politically loaded territories. And then who's doing that? And where's the power lying in that? Because I'm really mindful, if I go into any classroom where I'm opening up these kinds of issues, that I've got a very strong kind of political bias on all of this, and who am I to impose that? And I have to exercise that degree of caution, because I absolutely would not want a more right-wing teacher feeling that when they walked in to do that in a different school, they had the same right to impose their agenda. I don't have that right, and they don't have that right. So you have to open these things up in a way that doesn't allow anybody to inappropriately exercise power and impose an angle, which is an angle on a complex topic. And that's quite challenging.
Thank you. We're nearly at the end, but I know Claire, you've had your hand up. Do you have something you wanted to say?
Well, I just wanted to ask, perhaps particularly Richard, given the very worrying way you conveyed the state of what it's like to teach in the present system, and you know, from outside we can see a bit of that, but it's bleaker than even I thought it was. But as the parent of, you know, able children who do well at school, and not being someone who is in a position to home educate, nor actually do I think I'd want to, because it feels a bit isolationist to me, and I would prefer my kids to be part of the bigger world. What as a parent can I best do for my children and to support the school in this bleak situation?
I don't think I'll try and row back as hard as I can, because in a sense, I don't think the situation is bleak in lots of important ways. I think lots of the teachers working in the system are fantastic. Lots of what the schools in Bristol are doing, and I work closely with lots of them, and they're trying their very best to do great things. And so in reality, I know that the system fails quite a significant number of people.
Quite.
But there is a lot of people who are still able to flourish in it and progress and thrive because the schools do the very best.
But are there things as parents that we can do to support the people for whom it isn't working, if you like?
Yes. I think if it's working for your children, then you just keep doing the things that you're doing in terms of getting them curious and stretching them outside and beyond what the curriculum tramlines are prescribing. With respect to the students that it isn't working for, I think that becomes a more political thing. I think that's where voters, local politicians, and schools generally need to focus people's minds on these inequities and this narrowing that has taken place, and continue to express, deep dissatisfaction with it to people who have the power. I suppose that's my pessimism, is that I don't see the people with power changing the tram lines anytime very soon. But we have to focus in both directions. We have to continue to try and do the very best thing that we can within the tram lines as they're defined. And we need to blow up the track as soon as humanly possible, because that's where all these wonderful things Carla mentioned and Isla mentioned and Sarah mentioned, and so that's when all of this imagination and creativity suddenly gets to flourish again, is when these tram lines get blown up. And all the ideas need to be there ready. All of Peter's brilliant research, that is already going on in schools. People are talking about it in schools, but they're really constrained as to how much they can implement of it. But the research and discussion needs to happen, so that it's almost forcing the thing from the inside and the outside.
Maybe just a final thought, leading on from what you're saying, Richard. Is a better education system possible? Richard, do you want to? Yes? Yes from Richard. Iola, what do you think?
Hold on. Yes, maybe. Fingers crossed.
Adrian?
Yeah, I would reinforce, Emily, the book you recommended, the Who Are Universities For, if people want to take this further. And that really is an interesting discussion of a radical future for universities that I think would better serve society. I also think we need to resource education at every level better. And as a society, we need to be putting our money where our mouths are in terms of education, and that's really important to be doing. So
there's no one here to do it. I'll wave the flag for FE colleges. If you want to know where the real financial sinkhole is at the moment, it's in further education. And that's where all the diversity of courses could be happening, but isn't able to happen because FE is so catastrophically underfunded.
Can I just add one very quick thing? Very quickly, because I think it was Richard who said the education is slipping down the priority list, but let's remember, I just looked up, I think the Department of Education gets paid £58 billion a year to manage education, and that's their sole purpose, is to manage education, nothing else, not defense. That's their sole purpose. And why are we paying them this much money if they're not got our children's interests at heart, or have they got our children's interests at heart, or they got? Because I don't think the education system is neutral. I think it does have an agenda in a certain sense. So I think it's worth remembering that, the amount of money they get.
Thank you. And I guess my last thought would be, I think it is possible. I think I agree with everything the panel has been saying, but maybe thinking about how education is connected is something to think about broader, thinking about our city, about the inequalities of our city. And how actually things like race, things like poverty feed into that education system. So as well as the book that Adrian was mentioning, maybe start looking out for things that address this digital divide. You know, there are initiatives that are in progress in Bristol, people are creating, but how can we make our city more united racially, more united educationally, and how can we, and if you're looking to put money into things, then digital inequality is a huge issue for a lot of students in this city. So that's my last thought, but I'll just say thank you very much to the panel for your contributions and to your thoughts today. And yes, we'll leave it there today, but much to think about as we go on from here. So thank you very much, Richard, Iola, and Adrian. Thank you.
Thanks everybody else for your contribution.
Thank
Very
you.
great. Really good.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, everyone.
you.
Yeah. Just to add our thanks. This is the A Better World is Possible planning team right here. Thank you so much to Emily, Iola, Richard, and Adrian for being the panel, for really stimulating us, and for Imagine helping us along with the other contributions to the discussion, a really creative approach to the future of education. So we're really grateful to all of you and for everybody who's participated. Thank you so much. Yeah. And we'll do the Zoom wave now.
Bye.
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 Hopefully. The button is.